Welcome back to Harvard. We've been tracking the dirty, angry money out there that's infesting our political system this year especially. And here's a perfect example. A $10 million contribution to Karl Rove's group, Crossroads GPS. Think about it. However, unlike most political contributions, the group is under no obligation to disclose who gave that $10 million, or even if it was a single individual or some corporation who gave it. Doesn't have to say. That's because Crossroads GPS calls itself a social welfare organization, unlike its sister group, American Crossroads, also run by Karl Rove, which is a super PAC. But here's the wrinkle. The IRS says social welfare groups must be operated exclusively to promote social welfare and cannot make political activity its primary focus. Well, that's a tough argument for Crossroads GPS to make, since the vast majority of its ads are attacks by name on Democratic candidates. Here's one that goes after President Obama by name.
Typical Washington. Obama says spend more and promises jobs. Obama donors and insiders line up for handouts.
True engine of economic growth will always be companies like Solyndra.
Mr. President, we need jobs, not more Washington insider deals.
Well, Crossroads GPS would call that an issue ad, but who exactly believes that? Dan Frumkin is senior Washington correspondent for the Huffington Post and does a great job, and Joe Conason is editor-in-chief of the nationalmemo.com. I want to start with Dan, who's got us into this issue. I just looked at the law, and it clearly says if you spend this money on advertising in a campaign in opposition to any candidate, and here's Rove out there spending his GPS money against people like Tim Kaine, Bill Nelson, all these names and all these ads, directly in violation of the tax classification of these so-called nonprofits. How is he getting away with it?
Well, what they're trying to sort of define what they're doing by the FEC's rules. The Federal Election Commission has these notoriously hair-splitting rules about what's a political ad and what isn't. And by FEC rules, you actually have to use one of the magic words of, elect or vote, or don't elect or don't vote.
You mean dumping all over a candidate isn't opposing them?
As long as at the end you say something like, call them and tell them to stop, eating live puppies, or tell them to stop supporting Obamacare. By FEC rules, it's not technically a campaign ad. Now, that's a definition that only an FEC lawyer.
Well, what about the IRS? Aren't they tougher?
The IRS theoretically has a more common sense approach and looks at something with what they call facts and circumstances. And their rules seem very clear. But the question is whether they'll do anything about it.
Let's go over to Joe Conason. Joe, your view about this generally, because you think about this as much as I do, about our democracy and keeping it somewhat democratic, lowercase d, where people actually count more than the big money people.
One would hope. Look, anybody who looks at this understands that the FEC has failed to enforce any reasonable standard for these rules for many, many years. It's a political operation. It's staffed, and the commissioners are Democrats and Republicans, and the Democrats protect Democrats, the Republicans protect Republicans, and it's easy because of this, the nature of the commission, to have a stalemated vote. So they never really investigate anything with any vigor. The IRS is a different story, and I find it hard to believe, frankly, Chris, that the IRS is going to fall for Karl Rove's story that this is a social welfare organization. And hopefully they will decide that they ought to audit his group and see where they're actually spending the money, not take their word for it, and what that money's going for, and then see whether it falls within the rules, because I suspect it won't. And I suspect that if they do find that, then the donors who gave a $10 million contribution anonymously are going to find that Rove's promises that their names would never be revealed may in fact be wrong.
Well, also, it would seem to me that without going into sort of mind reading, that he's telling these people, if you give, these are right-wing people, business people, if you give this money, you will defeat Democrats. That's why they're giving the money.
Well, sure. And he's also promising that if you give them money, they won't, nobody will ever know who they are.
Well, that's number two. Let's take a look at some of these ads from Crossroads GPS. It's the Karl Rove operation going after Democrats. In this case, Tim Kaine, who's running for the Senate from Virginia, Ben Nelson, who's from, this guy has stopped running. He was going to run for re-election from Nebraska. And John Tester still running for re-election from Montana as a senator. Let's watch.
Tim Kaine has been Obama's partisan cheerleader, applauding every idea.
This stimulus is critically important to put people back to work.
As Virginia governor, Tim Kaine's reckless spending turned a budget surplus into a big deficit. Reckless spending, massive debt. No wonder Tim Kaine applauds Obama. What's wrong with Washington? Look at the damage he did. Higher taxes, cutting Medicare spending, embarrassing Nebraska. Ben Nelson sold out to Obama when it counted most. Senator, it's time to to make it right.
Remember this from John Tester?
Washington has lost its way, and we need to set it right.
But in Washington, Tester's way is Obama's way. Tester voted with President Obama 97% of the time. Tell John Tester, Obama's way is the wrong way for Montana. Tell him to say no to Obama's proposed $1 trillion deficit.
Is there a place in hell for the people that make those ads? Joe, is there some place like in a Superman movie where they go spinning off into space in a two-space screen and you never see them again? At least not till the sequel.
You know, the most we can probably hope for, Chris, is civil penalties and leave the rest of it to the Almighty. But I think...
you know, any of these grim voice guys, they always have a grim voice. You know, this is about to die here. And then they have the black and white and the old newspaper clippings. It's the same old M.O. Go ahead. Your thoughts, Joe.
Well, look... nothing is going to change about this until people rise up and decide that the politicians need to reform this system. And, you know, luckily there is a sign that finally they're going too far, and that this year, after the Republican campaign with all the super PAC spending in the primaries, that people are disgusted at long last. You and I both know, Chris, that for years now, most voters have paid very little attention to these reform issues. It just hasn't been on the radar for them, either war or the economy, something else. But this year, there seems to be some suggestion that people are paying attention now. There's a new poll that's going to come out tomorrow from Democracy Corps and the Public Campaign Action Fund, and it's going to show that this is a salient issue for a lot of voters this year.
I heard it's coming. Well, let's take it as according to Crossroads GPS's tax returns, just under 100 donors gave a total of $77 million between June 2010 and December 2011. That includes 2 donations that were around $10 million. There were 4 other donations between $4 and $5 million. According to the LA Times, by the way, 24 donors gave at least $1 million. And this is the question, Dan, I don't know what your views are, but philosophically, expound on them right now. If you can run a series of ads in, say, a state like North Carolina, which is going to be closer, Ohio, and you can just pound the airways all through October, and you have the money to do that without even having your name show up, you got a lot more power than a couple hundred voters, probably a lot more power than several thousand voters.
Yeah, at the congressional level, the money is going to be astonishingly effective in terms of defining the candidates, in terms of creating a public mood, in terms of, and with secret money comes the potential for corruption and for
payoffs.
Yeah, it's a big slush fund, basically.
You mean they might be able to get in and see the winning candidate after they've given $10 million to him?
Well, you know, it's going to be secret to you and me. It's not going to be secret to the candidate who they gave money to.
That's so right.
But, you know, Karl Rove always looks like a genius until he doesn't. You know, he tends to look really smart until everything collapses in disaster around him.
You mean W's not still seen as a successful president?
There's no permanent
I thought he was. He was the architect of that one. Anyway, he's fair game. Anyway, Dan Frumkin, thank you very much, and Joe Conason up.